My husband's family tradition is about to ruin our son's life. When I was 8 months pregnant, my mother-in-law showed up at our house with a lawyer and a pile of papers, trying to legally force me to name my unborn son Nimrod. I'd known this was coming. My husband's family had a long-standing tradition where the firstborn son in every generation for the past 400 years was named Nimrod. They even had a massive family tree hanging in their living room, showing every single Nimrod going all the way back to the 1600s. My husband, luckily, was the second son, so he got to be named Blake, which in that family was basically like winning the lottery. His older brother got stuck with Nimrod and now goes by Rod, which isn't much better, but at least it doesn't immediately make people think his parents hated him when I got pregnant. His family was over the moon that the tradition might continue since Rod only had daughters. My father-in-law even raised a glass of champagne and toasted to baby Nimrod. I laughed, thinking it was a joke, but nobody else laughed. That night, I told Blake there was absolutely no way I was naming our son Nimrod. He agreed right away, saying he'd always hated the tradition and thought it was cruel to stick a kid with that name in modern times. We decided to name our baby Charlie and just deal with his parents being upset. We thought that would be the end of it. We were very wrong. His family launched a full-blown pressure campaign. They showed up at our house every day with new arguments for why we had to use the name. My father-in-law kept insisting that Nimrod was a mighty hunter in the Bible, a name of strength and leadership, completely ignoring that nowadays most people think it means idiot. They went overboard, buying baby clothes, blankets, and toys embroidered with Nimrod, ordering a custom crib with the name carved into it, even redoing their guest room into Nimrod's nursery. My father-in-law told us he'd already added our son's name to the family trust and, legally, it had to be Nimrod to qualify for inheritance. Then the entire extended family got involved. Aunts, uncles, cousins, even Blake's grandfather, another Nimrod, flew in to guilt trip us. They held a family meeting where everyone took turns explaining why the name had to continue. Blake's brother, Nimrod, even said, "It sucked for me, but you get used to it. It's who we are." I pointed out that he literally goes by Rod, and he said that was different. After weeks of constant pressure, Blake started cracking. He began suggesting compromises, like using it as a middle name or changing the spelling. I told him absolutely not. Then he got defensive, saying I didn't understand how much the name meant to his family. That's when the bribe started. His parents promised to pay for our baby's college, give us a down payment on a new house, even set up a trust fund, but only if we named him Nimrod. Blake started talking about how nice it would be to not worry about money. He began having long phone calls with his parents, leaving the room and coming out looking stressed, refusing to tell me what they discussed. He said, "Maybe we're being too stubborn, it's just a name." I reminded him that he'd always said he was grateful not to have been named Nimrod himself. He just sighed and said, that was different. When I was 8.5 months pregnant, his parents showed up with a lawyer. They sat us down and presented legal documents, an agreement that we'd name the baby Nimrod in exchange for $200,000 and a guaranteed inheritance. The lawyer calmly explained that if we refused, we'd be cut out of the will completely. Blake just stared at the papers, and I could see him actually considering it. I stood up and told them to get out of my house. My mother-in-law burst into tears. My father-in-law said I was making a huge mistake. Blake said nothing. After they left, Blake and I had the biggest fight of our marriage. He said I was being unreasonable and that $200,000 could change our lives. I said our son's happiness mattered more than money. He argued that kids get teased for all sorts of things, and I said, sure, but most parents don't choose to make their kid a target. We didn't speak for 2 days, then I went into labor. On the drive to the hospital, Blake kept saying, we'll figure out the name later, don't worry about it. Something went wrong during delivery. I started bleeding badly, and the doctors said I was hemorrhaging. The room filled with people. The last thing I remember was a nurse saying they needed to start a transfusion immediately. When I woke up 12 hours later, Blake was sitting beside my bed holding our baby. He was crying. He handed me the birth certificate and whispered, I'm so sorry. The name printed on it was Nimrod. I just stared at it, the official seal, my old pre-registration signature, and then that name typed where Charles should have been. Blake kept talking, saying how the doctors didn't think I'd make it, how his parents told him it's what I would have wanted, how he was scared and just signed everything they put in front of him. I looked up from the paper to Blake's face, tear-streaked, desperate, and then down at the tiny person in the bassinet beside my bed. The baby who was supposed to be Charlie, but was now legally someone else entirely. Blake reached for my hand, but I pulled it away. I told him to leave. He started crying harder, saying we could fix it, that he was sorry, but I just kept repeating that he needed to go right now because I couldn't even look at him. The nurse who'd been checking my blood pressure caught my eye and quietly asked if I wanted her to enforce visitor restrictions. I nodded. Blake stood there for a few seconds like he might argue, then finally turned and walked out, shoulders shaking. The door clicked shut and I was alone with a baby whose legal name made me sick to my stomach, still hooked up to 4 lines from nearly bleeding to death 12 hours earlier. I picked him up carefully, mindful of the tubes and wires, and whispered that his name was Charlie, no matter what any paper said. He made a small sound, and I started crying. Not the pretty kind of crying, the kind where you can't breathe right, where your chest hurts and everything comes out in gasps. Hours later, after feeding him, changing him, and memorizing every tiny detail of his face, a woman in scrubs knocked softly and introduced herself as the evening social worker. She sat in the chair Blake had vacated and started asking the usual questions about home support and postpartum resources. Then she glanced at the chart and paused. She asked why I kept calling the baby Charlie when all the paperwork said Nimrod. I told her everything, the 400-year family tradition, the pressure campaign, how Blake signed the papers while I was unconscious. She listened quietly the whole time, not interrupting once. When I finished, she said birth certificate amendments were possible but would require a legal process. She offered to connect me with a patient advocate who specialized in these situations. She wrote down a name and an extension number on a sticky note, pressed it onto my bedside table, and squeezed my hand. "I'll check on you tomorrow," she said before leaving. I was still holding that note when Blake's parents showed up around 7 that evening. I heard his mother's voice first, loud and overly cheerful, talking about a photographer and newborn pictures. The same nurse from earlier intercepted them at the door. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught bits like approved visitors only and mother's wishes. Then came the crying, his mother's trademark dramatic sobs, claiming she was being denied access to her grandson. Blake's father's voice rose, demanding to know who gave the hospital the right to keep grandparents out. The nurse stayed calm and firm until their voices finally faded down the hallway. I texted Blake that his parents needed to leave the hospital completely, or I'd call security myself. He didn't reply. Around 11 that night, he came back, moving quietly, like he thought I might be asleep. I wasn't. I'd been lying in the dark feeding Charlie, listening to the sounds of the hospital, trying to figure out what came next. Blake sat down beside me and started whispering apologies, excuses, fear. He said he panicked, that when he heard words like hemorrhage and transfusion, he thought I was dying. That his parents told him I would have wanted the tradition honored. I whispered back that his parents clearly had those documents prepared in advance, that they'd planned this, and he'd chosen to side with them over me. He said he thought he was losing me. I said that didn't make it okay to sign away our son's identity. We went back and forth like that for nearly an hour, keeping our voices low so we wouldn't wake the baby between us. Finally, Blake left again, and we still hadn't found any kind of peace. I barely slept. Every time I started to drift off, a nurse would come in to check vitals or bring medication, and each time they'd glance at the chart and say something about baby Nimrod. Every time I heard it, this wave of anger and helplessness washed over me, magnified by all the postpartum hormones. I held Charlie, my Charlie, and tried to figure out how to make it right. The next morning, a man in a hospital polo knocked and introduced himself as Franklin McCoy, the patient advocate. He said the social worker had told him about my situation and that he wanted to explain the process for amending a birth certificate. He sat down with a folder full of forms and went through everything. I'd need to file a petition with family court, show cause for the change, and document that the name had been signed without my consent. He explained that emergencies like mine sometimes qualified for expedited review, though he couldn't promise anything. Before leaving, he handed me his card and mentioned a family law attorney named Margie McCoy, no relation to him, who specialized in these cases. He said he could provide an affidavit describing the circumstances if it would help. I thanked him, feeling for the first time in days like maybe this wasn't completely hopeless. 2 days later, I was discharged from the hospital with a packet of postpartum care instructions and a follow-up appointment card, and on it, printed in neat black letters, was a name that still didn't feel real: Nimrod. Blake drove us home in silence. The car seat we'd installed months ago now held a baby whose legal name we'd never agreed on. When we pulled up, his parents were on the porch under a huge banner that read, "Welcome home, Nimrod," in blue letters, balloons tied to it. I didn't even get out of the car. I told Blake to take it down before we went inside. His mother burst into tears about rejecting family heritage. Blake hesitated, then pulled the banner down while his father tried to stop him. We went inside, locked the door, and didn't speak. That first night was brutal. Charlie cried for hours, and we barely spoke, moving around like strangers. Around 3 a.m., Blake suggested we could use both names, Nimrod legally, Charlie at home. I told him that kind of compromise was exactly why we were in this mess. Our son needed parents who'd fight for him, not give in. Blake said nothing, just took the baby and kept walking. The next morning, the doorbell rang. Blake's father stood in our living room in a suit, holding a folder from the family trust. He pointed to a highlighted section. Proof of a birth certificate with the name Nimrod had to be submitted within 30 days, or both Charlie and Blake would lose their inheritance. Then he left. Blake just stood there staring at the folder, pale and silent. Later, while looking through my hospital papers, I found the pre-registration form I'd filled out months ago. I'd written Charles in black ink, but someone had crossed it out and written Nimrod in blue. The hospital records clerk said Blake's mother had submitted an updated form the day I went into labor, claiming we'd changed our minds. That's when I realized they'd planned this from the start. The first week home blurred into sleepless nights and endless crying. During short breaks, I researched how to legally change a baby's name. Every source said the same thing: petitions, court filings, published notices, months of process, and thousands of dollars. I felt trapped. Blake kept worrying about his father's deadline. I couldn't even process it. I was too exhausted. By the end of the week, Blake called the lawyer the patient advocate had mentioned, Margie McCoy. At her small, cluttered office, we told her everything. She listened quietly, then said our case was valid. If one parent signed without the other's consent, the court could amend the birth certificate. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. Margie said we'd need solid proof, evidence of the pressure campaign, and that Blake wasn't in a sound state of mind when he signed. She asked if we had documentation. I told her about the texts and emails. Blake mentioned the nursery videos, the monogrammed items, and the custom crib. Margie took notes and said to send everything: messages, photos, the $200,000 contract, and especially the altered hospital form. She warned us it could get ugly because Blake's family would fight back. That second week postpartum, I built an evidence folder while caring for Charlie. I saved every text and email, took photos of every Nimrod item, and Blake wrote a detailed 12-page timeline of every call and meeting. Reading it all together made us both realize how extreme his family's manipulation had been. We sent it to Margie, and 2 days later she said our case was strong, but it would cost several $1,000s and likely lead to his parents cutting us off financially. That night, Blake and I stayed up going over bills and my medical expenses. He suggested maybe using both names again, but I told him that would only teach our son to give in under pressure. We agreed to move forward legally, even if it scared us. Blake found a couples therapist, Eli Booth, because I told him our marriage wouldn't survive without help. The first session was tense. Blake defended signing, saying he'd been terrified I might die. I said fear didn't excuse betrayal. Eli kept redirecting us toward healing, giving us homework about what kind of family we wanted to be. At the second session, he had us talk about values, what we wanted Charlie to learn about loyalty and independence. Blake broke down, saying he finally saw that he'd chosen his parents' approval over our partnership, and he didn't want Charlie growing up thinking that was okay. For the first time, I felt like he truly understood. A week later, the pediatrician's office called to confirm Charlie's legal name for insurance. I had to say Nimrod out loud. Hearing it spoken, official, permanent, broke something in me. I hung up and started crying while Blake took Charlie and paced the room. All our progress suddenly felt fragile because no matter how much we tried, our son was still legally Nimrod. Every official interaction became a painful reminder that we'd lost control of the most basic parenting decision. That afternoon, I posted a photo of Charlie sleeping with a simple heart caption. Within minutes, Blake's Aunt Jennifer screenshotted it and sent it to the family group chat. By dinner, our phones were exploding with messages, accusations of disrespecting the family name, spitting on 400 years of tradition, being ungrateful. Blake's grandfather sent a 2-minute voice rant about dishonoring their legacy. His father typed in all caps that the name on the birth certificate was what mattered, and we needed to stop this charade. I finally took the phone and turned it off. 3 days later, Blake's parents showed up unannounced. I was nursing Charlie when their truck pulled into the driveway with something big under a tarp. They revealed a $3,000 custom crib with Nimrod carved into the headboard. Blake told them it wasn't coming inside. His mother cried. His father accused us of being spiteful and wasteful. They argued on the porch until his father said they'd keep it until we came to our senses. The next morning, a large envelope arrived with a $200,000 check labeled for Nimrod's future, conditional acceptance of family tradition. Blake's father's note said the money was ours if we dropped the name change petition. I called Margie immediately. She said not to cash it, to make copies and file it as evidence. I did. Blake asked if we were really turning down that much money. I reminded him our son's identity wasn't for sale. That evening, Blake's cousin Rod messaged me privately. He apologized for not warning me how extreme his parents could get and admitted his own childhood had been miserable because of the name Nimrod. He'd gone by Rod since middle school and still hated seeing his legal name on documents. He said he wished someone had fought for him the way we were fighting for Charlie. Rod shared contact info for Rachel Franco, a family mediator who'd helped him set boundaries with their parents. Blake called Rachel the next day. She offered to facilitate a conversation if everyone agreed. Blake was hopeful a neutral mediator could help his parents understand. I wasn't. I'd already seen how far they'd go to control us. I didn't expect one mediation session to change anything, but I agreed to go so Blake could see for himself that his parents wouldn't compromise. The session took place during week 4 at Rachel's office. She set ground rules, but Blake's mother started crying before we even began. His father sat with his arms crossed, already angry. Blake explained that we just wanted our son to have a normal name. I told them I never consented to Nimrod and woke up from surgery to find my son's identity taken from me. Blake's father repeated the 400-year tradition speech and claimed the family trust required the name Nimrod exactly. His mother cried about being the generation that broke the chain. Rachel tried suggesting middle name options or similar names, but they rejected everything. They wouldn't acknowledge their manipulation or the lawyers, money, and pressure they'd used. His father said they'd done nothing wrong, only tried to preserve something important. The session ended with no resolution. That week, Franklin McCoy called to check on me after the traumatic birth. I broke down and told him everything: the family pressure, the legal fight, and the exhaustion. He said he remembered Blake's parents outside the operating room pressuring him and Blake while I was in surgery. Franklin offered to write an affidavit confirming that Blake had seemed overwhelmed and pressured when he signed the birth certificate. It was the first time I felt someone outside the family understood what had happened. I also joined an online postpartum support group. Most posts were about sleepless nights and breastfeeding, but one woman shared how she'd fought a similar name battle with her in-laws and legally changed her daughter's name. Reading her story and hearing that her family eventually accepted it gave me hope that we could win too. She messaged me advice on the process, which made everything feel more possible. During week 5, Blake's father called with a new offer. He'd pay my $40,000 in medical bills if we dropped the name change. Blake looked torn, but I stopped him. I reminded him that our son's identity wasn't for sale at any price. I told Blake it didn't matter if it was $40,000 or $400,000. We weren't selling the right to name our child. Blake told his father we couldn't accept, and his father called us prideful before hanging up. That night, we sat at the kitchen table and wrote a formal email to his parents, setting clear boundaries. No visits or contact until they could respect and use the name we chose. Blake added a note saying he loved them but loved his son more, and their behavior had damaged their relationship. We both signed and sent it. Watching that email go out felt like the first time we'd been on the same side since Charlie was born. The next morning, Blake's father called, cold and businesslike. He listed everything we were losing: the college fund, the house down payment, the emergency account, and Blake's inheritance. We had 1 week to reconsider, or it would all be gone. Blake sat there stunned. I reminded him money didn't matter more than our son's identity.